Hello, high noon indeed, at 12 o'clock. I think it'll only be standing room only now. We've filled the tables and the places, so thank you all for coming. I know there's some stiff competition out there. There's a lot to get through over the 2 days, and particularly in this hour. My name's Tim Warneford. I'm kindly joined by Capital Law with Nicola and Emma today. Thank you very much for coming. I sit on the advisory panel for the Education Estates, and every year the numbers of applications grow. I mean, I think we probably had something like 200, and to try and sort of triage those into maybe 80 slots is always quite a difficult thing to do. There'll be different agendas because we'll be trying to look at statutory and HE and FE, and there's a lot of stuff to try and sort of squeeze down. I always try and run a separate session in here. I'm afforded that luxury, and I always try and work out what I think is the most pressing issue for our sector, which may not have been included on the main in the main hall. And so this year, for me, we refer to it as a new Procurement Act, but obviously it's the Procurement Act 2023. It's just a little bit of catch-up to do. Obviously, we've had a new government who traditionally will always look for greater scrutiny in terms of public spending. And certainly in our sector, there's also a CMA investigation going on. So there's a lot of eyes in terms of how school trusts procure. Obviously, they'll have their own internal systems, of course. However, public sector schools are included in there. I know we will get onto some exemptions shortly. But for me, this was a really, really important subject, and I think the fact that you're all here to try and understand how it might work for you as well is a really good sign. When we were thinking about how we would design this, we kind of ended up thinking, well, SWOT would be a simple way. It's a way that everyone can kind of understand in terms of what the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats are. So I think that's what we've kind of decided to do, isn't it, really? I always judge presentations on the amount of audience participation. And some people would say that this was a relatively staid or dry subject, hence the fact that we've got our SWOT bingo cards here. So you can mark off as the key phrases come out, which will obviously be responsible for as we read them. But I really would encourage you to ask questions. I'm pretty agnostic in terms of when you choose to ask those questions. I know that you two may...
Feel free to interrupt.
Yeah, we're more than happy for that to happen, because really this is for you guys. It's for you to bring your own sort of specific... There's a couple here, gents, and there's one over there, I think. This is your opportunity to particularly, cross-examine the experts here. I'm merely facilitating this. This is just something that my own clients will need to adapt to. So please take advantage of... excuse me, there's a seat here if you want. So please feel free to challenge, to come on in and ask us some questions. So without any further yakking from me, which one of you would like to lead?
Well, I
Emma,
can go
do you want to?
first, yeah. I'm happy to. So,
Thank you.
So I'm Nicola, and I'm on a public procurement perspective. Emma is construction, so we will try to amalgamate the two together. So to give you an overview, Procurement Act came into force on the 24th of Feb this year. It replaced 4 other regimes, so the intention is for it to be simpler, more transparent, and allow SME access. It applies to all public sector bodies. Primary changes are there's now 2 procedures instead of many. So we've got the open and the competitive flex procedure. And there's an increase in transparency duties, so more notices. There's KPI and reporting requirements. And there's a contract management focus. So an emphasis on outcomes, social value and innovation. So without further ado, should we move on to strengths?
Yeah. Let's look at the strength. Let's accentuate the positives here, okay? So, with eyes down, ears open. Let's look at the strengths, shall we? In terms of, this is the reason I'm excited about it is that traditionally, I think we've missed some tricks in terms of how we have used as the client to go to market and make sure that we extract best value out there, and I think that this affords us a really incredible platform now, doesn't it, to move away from just lowest price. It's such a blunt tool. Why don't we explore other options that are available to you or the commissioning client?
Yeah. So from our perspective, we've got So as Tim says, promoting value. So that is a move from meet to mat. So it used to be most economically advantageous tender. We're now on most advantageous tender. So that in itself means that you can consider those other factors more within your procurement exercises and not just say, oh, well, they're the cheapest, let's go with that. We've also got an ability to demonstrate due diligence. So by running your competitive tenders in a flexible way, you can ensure that you've made those tick box exercises and find the most suitable supplier in that case. This also complies with Academy Trust Handbook practices, which is always useful. We've got the ability for market leverage. So the competitive flexible procedure allows contracting authorities to design procurement processes that are more effective for them. It is based upon what they need and their objectives from the procurement exercise. So by doing this, market leverage can be instigated through pre-market engagement exercises, negotiation, dialogue, those types of steps within your procurement process. And another strength from it is the simplification. So as I said earlier, we've got 4 regimes into one now. So previously we had things like defence and security regs, utilities, concession, and then the public contract regs. It's all in that one place, so it should be easier to follow. And then with that, we've got some potential exemptions depending on what type of authority you are. So for example, schools, if you're within the category of schools, which is quite broad, there's lots of subheadings as to what that is classified as. The below threshold regulations under the Act do not apply. This doesn't mean there's no requirements to comply with public law for below threshold, but you just don't have to apply those Act requirements. So weaknesses now.
Can I just, while we're still on strengths,
Yeah.
I just want to sort of maybe tease out a little bit more from meet to mat.
Yeah.
So we've obviously talked about it being a relatively blunt tool because you've been effectively constrained by the economic side of that, which again, from my reading, has always been a relatively short-term lowest price.
Yeah.
And I think what we're being encouraged here to do is, again, to look further afield, to take a more strategic view and look at advantages,
Yeah.
of which we can talk about social value. We can talk about bringing in all sorts of other things that we could then, almost in scope 3 terms, sweat the supply chain to be able to bring to the table. So for us, from next year, when we are procuring on behalf of SCA-funded trusts, we will be looking at it, whether they've got, for example, an existing climate action plan. And if they haven't got an existing climate action plan, that is one of the things that we would then be sweating our contractors to make sure that they're going to pay. So they're going to get more bang for buck here, okay? Some schools can't afford a climate action plan, okay? So one of the things that we can extract from our contractors is to the value to make sure that they have one. And then the knock-on effects from the school having a climate action plan, okay, tick in terms of its regulatory requirements, but really, really importantly, it can then start to procure in a much more sophisticated way and meet its decarb agenda as well. So there's so many little advantages, isn't there, to move away just from what we were constricted with before. Then we'll go on, in a minute, we'll go on to how we're going to get to that place. But I just want to create the sort of the New Jerusalem out there, the idea that there is some great wins to have here as long as you can grasp it and apply it in the right way. Is that okay?
And I think the other thing to say with that is that in itself, in turn, creates a stronger procurement structure more generally, doesn't it? You know, you're creating a higher accountability level for everyone by doing that. So it's got far more advantages to the whole procurement process than just economic, doesn't it? So yeah, I agree with you.
To get social value and things like that, which again, it's not, it runs through it's not actually named, is it? It's actually just run through the guidance, but it's something that we're obviously going to be looking to do. Obviously, in social housing, having social value in there is old school. But hello, sorry.
Can I ask you a question about social value? So I work for a contractor, and lots of contractors will make all kinds of commitments in their bids. How can you as clients ensure that that's actually delivered by them?
So we can get into KPIs and things, please.
I was going to say, so kind of a KPI side of things. So how you can do that now is link it up to the KPI and say, right, so you've said this, by achieving this percentage, this objective, you're performing it. So that'll be how it's dealt with now, I'd expect. And more so with that, you've got the transparency and notices requirements. KPI notices is part of that. So it's going to be out there in the open.
We find a
Yeah.
So for us good contractors that do the things that we say
Yeah.
we do, it's always it's never a level playing field. You get the
Yeah,
the
absolutely.
rogue contractors.
Absolutely. I mean, we did a session specifically on social value a few months ago, and there's a lot to it. I mean, the AI is massively moving forward as well in terms of being able to track it, in terms of accountability. And not just that, in terms of improving the entire industry's ability to do it, because you may be doing a great job, and somebody else may be claiming to do a great job, but they haven't got the accountability, they haven't got the KPIs in place, the AI's that not there tracking it. And so actually the point is we need to be upskilling everybody to get there. And
Yeah.
we ended up having a very interesting discussion around whether it's a good idea for it to be competitive in that way, or whether, you know, contractors who are, you know, from different organisations, back-to-back sites, neighbouring sites, could actually achieve better social value by working together in that community spirit, because you may not have a position for an apprentice on your site, but your neighbour might do. But if it's targeted, does that actually push you towards you know, not wanting to hand over the potential apprentice, even though he could have a job tomorrow?
Yeah. I think educated contractors want to do the best.
Absolutely.
Through social value, because it's not really about us. It's about what we're leaving behind. And
For some of the smaller contracts, contract duration, unfortunately, an apprenticeship wouldn't be appropriate because they're just not long enough. In social housing, where they're running for years, you've got plenty of time to upskill, etc. So that's why we'd probably be trying to look for things like, you know, as I say, sustainability angles or decarb angles, something that we also feel that the client would get the added value of having, because they can't afford it at the upfront end. But you're doing the right thing, and we're probably going to move on to, when we look at some of the, you know, weaknesses, etc., is in terms of the client. We've said that there's a great opportunity, but it's about the client's management of that contract. So I can understand when you're doing the right thing and you know that some of your competitors are not, and the client is not overseeing that and enforcing that. That's something that we definitely need to ensure that they grasp and drive through. So I hear what you're saying. And
Absolutely.
do we want to go on to weaknesses?
Yes. From my perspective, I'm a construction lawyer. So I mainly focus on procurement of construction contracts. Nicola and I work together really regularly on that. And we have a number of clients who are education institutions. And there's a number of trends that comes from that in terms of how education institutions operate their procurement. And on the whole, they're not actually compliant with the current previous legislation, which is still in place for certain frameworks which were procured under that legislation. So the issue that we have is, on the whole, education institutions are not very sophisticated at procurement. And so the actual key driver is going to have to be, you're going to have to improve. There is... Basically, there's a lack of detail in lots of organisations' governance documents dealing with procurement processes, how you should follow processes through, contracting processes, as well as sign-off processes. One of the biggest changes actually in the legislation is the transparency element, the accountability of publishing award notices, and documentation like that. But the trends that we're seeing is that there's nothing built into any of the governance documents dealing with that part of it. There's often an element of sending it out to an external consultant. Well, they'll deal with the procurement process. I don't need to worry about it. They do it all for me. However, the onus is on the institution. They are the public authority. They're the public body. They're the responsible party. Pushing it out to a procurement consultant who may not necessarily do it for them is not an excuse. So the governance documents are going to need to be moved forward to be compliant, to build in that notification. One of the other key things that we've seen is an over-reliance on frameworks built into governance documents. So the idea that if you are choosing to operate a framework which has been procured properly through the legislation, then that's fine. You don't need to worry about anything else. But that's absolutely not the case. You need to understand that framework. You need to understand the boundaries within it, the rules within it, the steps within it to be taken, and those steps need to be followed. It's not a case of, okay, well, I've selected a framework which is properly procured, and then I've ticked the box, legislation is compliant. I think there's a huge misunderstanding in terms of how much there is to do to follow the steps. There's a massive over-reliance on direct award, which I think Nicola would agree with me in saying that I think what a number of our clients have been doing is procurement is on the too difficult pile. And everybody leaves their too difficult pile until the last moment. So it sits there in the too difficult pile, and then by the time they feel that they have to deal with it, it's urgent. However, it's only urgent because they've left it. And urgency is not a justification if it's as a result of your failure to act early enough, when you could have acted early enough if you had had the appropriate processes in place to help you do that. So from my perspective, the biggest weakness is the way that procuring authorities have been doing it in the past and their lack of organisation from a procurement perspective. Because if you actually set yourself up in a way that your governance documents allowed you to do it, you had a contracting process, you had a procurement process which helped you and led you through the stages of what you needed to do. If there are frameworks that you use all the time, that you've actually got guidance on those specific frameworks. How do we do it under this framework, which we like to use quite often? That would then enable you to protect yourself against potential Procurement Act breaches. The conversation that Nicola and I were having when we just sat in the Speaker's Lounge was authorities have not been doing it right, and they've been getting away with not doing it right. However, the new legislation is going to force that to change, essentially, because there are going to be greater penalties for not complying. And at some point, somebody is going to be held accountable, and there will be, somebody will be the scapegoat to it and be made an example of for failure to comply. And the fact that the new legislation brings in this ability to suspend contracts that have been awarded that's not in compliance with the procurement rules, and potentially terminate those. Yes?
Sorry, just on that point then. So we've seen in a couple of recent schemes by public entities, consultancy, they're going now open market, and it's almost going too far the other way. And so, as an example, one particular job, there's 35 different consultants signed up. So kind of what you're saying there, is it showing at the foot that people are now too scared to effectively run a competitive, flexible procurement? So they're just defaulting to the open, which then is actually really arduous for us all, and it puts us off procuring, or tendering, sorry, for projects.
Yeah, so if I take that
absolutely.
I've noticed this. So I saw a stat on LinkedIn the other day. I can't remember the stat, don't ask me that. But it was that open procedure is being used far more than competitive flex. And I don't think that's necessarily the right way of doing it. At the end of the day, competitive flex covers all those other procedures we used to have. So to then go, well, I'm not touching it because I'm unsure, is not the right approach to it. So I think, and it's what we've all said, it's the education side of things, I think, for contracting authorities. And that's not all contracting authorities, but there is now an example. It's illustrated, isn't it, that there is kind of this wall of, I don't really know what I'm doing, I'm not going to do it. So competitive flex, I personally think it's quite a good way of procuring, because you can still use those old methods we used to have under the PCR or whatever it may be. But if we sort of look at it and go, oh, well, actually, doing that there didn't really work, but having negotiation or having presentations or whatever it may be, that really would help us work out what we want and what we need and innovate. So, yeah, I think it's a lack of education at the moment, and that can happen, can't it? People just need to upskill and actually understand. It's not scary, it's not daunting as it sounds, it's just we don't know what we're doing yet. but take a step back and actually go, okay, I do know what I'm doing, and So yeah, I agree. I
The
think it needs to
difficulty
change.
is obviously in a school sector, not the most sophisticated,
Yeah.
don't have deep pockets in terms of all of the requisite training that's going to be required to grasp the opportunities here. So it's all very well us saying you need to do this, you need to do that. There's lots of risk and threats there, but frankly, without any investment, without upskilling them on contract management, they are going to continue to be at risk, aren't they?
Yeah.
We've got no case law, we've got no challenges on this yet, so we've got nothing else that we can kind of come back from either, have we? It feels like virgin territory and everyone's feeling their way. And, the other flip side of innovation is high risk, isn't it? Everyone talks about innovation and how wonderful it is, but you've got to build in the risk in terms of that as well. So I think institutions are feeling their way. They're not confident yet. That any tranche of upskilling that they desperately require is a million miles away. I mean, genuinely, I reached out to Capital Law because other solicitors that I've used in the past don't necessarily have an in-house procurement team. There's a big gap in the market. I know we know Stone King, etc., but it's such a specialist skill now. And I keep going back to the fact that there is a balance here between the opportunity and the wins that you can have, but boy, is there a responsibility that comes with that as well, isn't there?
There is absolutely a huge responsibility, but if you spend the time now and improve your processes and procedures and get yourself in a position, you can protect yourself for the long term. Actually, if it's set up properly for you, then it's relatively easy to follow the steps through. What is the difficult thing is coming in and essentially having no procedure or very flimsy procedure, and then thinking that you can try and adapt that for use with the new legislation when it just doesn't really work for it. I mean, we've seen clients with thresholds wrong in their compliance documents, having not even really realised that things had moved on even at that very, very basic level. So it's just a case of knowing that you actually just have to put a bit of work in and get things up to speed. And then, 6 months to a year's time, they'll be flying if things can be put into place.
Sorry then, how would we demonstrate that value to a client based on there being no applicable case law, it's completely theoretical, this is, if you don't comply, this is what can happen. How is, delivery partners, consultants, contractors, how can we really help?
I genuinely advocate, even when it's down to things like condition surveys, I always start with the premise, what's the output? What is required at the end? Not to start there with a vague idea about what I want, but to actually work backwards. So obviously things like, we've talked about early engagement, running workshops to get under the skin, because sometimes, like when you have to write a CV for your son or daughter, they're the world's worst at being able to write it out. We have to tease it out of them, don't we? We have to talk about, what skills have you got? What advantages, etc. And it's the investment to be able to work alongside someone who understands the process better and to be able to tease those things out slowly to understand how you might frame things. That would be one of the things I would obviously recommend, which I guess you guys do anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what we've done quite a lot is, obviously we've updated documents. However, we have also run a lot of training. We've run a lot of workshops with basically fictitious scenarios, because people relate to actual scenarios. People don't necessarily see risks until you put it into the context of their school or their college and what could happen to them for failing to actually follow the steps. So I think that's all we can do at the moment in terms of trying to get people upskilled in it, and trying to get them informed. Until we get to such point as, somebody is made the example of. Yes.
Hey, Hirsch.
Do you have a question?
Oh, sorry.
How do you support people to be upskilled? How do you support authorities to be upskilled? Because it sounds like there's lots of information about how you're going to get penalised. Look, it's going to happen. But how do you get there? If people can scenario test loads of things about, this is the penalty and this is how it will materially happen. What will materially happen to you? But where's the support?
Hopefully we began this, and you're right, it's a balance, always carrot and stick, isn't there? you've got to navigate around that. Hopefully part of the motivation to achieve the opportunities, which we'll get onto in a minute, and the successes, is to be motivated to want to do that, undoubtedly, and not always be focused on the fear aspect, the risk aspect. It's a really fair question. Everything that ever goes on in this sector, we always go back to, well, okay, where's the money coming from? If you're a small primary school with 100 kids, a DFC of £5,000 or whatever, where's the money coming from to go and get that sort of upskilling and that sort of training investment? It is a really difficult call, without a shadow of a doubt. Hopefully it's sort of round table or workshops like this that gets fed back up the chain to sort of say, it's a great idea, it's lovely that you've introduced this, but actually we need a bit of support here. We're not a 50, 60 school, Matt, with millions of pounds of reserves to be able to make that investment. So I hear you. It's always welcome to our world, isn't it? This is our sector. This is what we live and breathe every day in terms of how the lack of money there is.
Absolutely. I mean, obviously, if you're procuring on a much smaller scale, your documents, your compliance paperwork is not going to be as detailed as if you're a big university and you have a huge estates portfolio. However, because of the nature of the organisation, you should still have some compliance documents, even if they're relatively brief. And the first point of call is pulling those out. What do you do if, I don't know, you have a leak in your roof? What do you do? What's your process for repairing that hole in the roof? How do you obtain a contractor? How do you go through the process of deciding which contractor to involve?
So here might be a really good opportunity to bring in exemptions. So what we're talking about obviously is thresholds in terms of spend that a CFO might have or an SBM might have, but we also need to talk about exemptions in terms of the education sector as well.
Exactly. I mean, Nicola's obviously the expert on exemptions.
Yeah. So as I said at the start, we got that kind of below threshold side of things. So if it's services, it's about 214,000. If it's construction, it's about 5 million. So under that, you don't necessarily have to follow the Procurement Act. But as I said before, we still got that public law side of things, so transparency, potential consultation rights, things like that. So those themselves are not going to be subject to a full procurement exercise. They're not going to be subject to a full cost of and resource of a procurement exercise. So that helps. Whether, in theory, a lot of the contracts will be below those thresholds is debatable. But I think just honing back on the point of the governance documents and things like that, I know saying investing is not always useful, but if you invest at that stage in getting good, up-to-date documents, you're going to invest less in the future because you, as Emma says, you might have a process there that says, right, this is what you do, and then you can just follow that, and it will make it so much simpler and less resource heavy.
It's still understanding though, isn't it, that even if you are below threshold because you have an exemption because you're a school or just because your contract value is lower, there's still the idea of needing to achieve best value. And this is kind of a concept that's put out that, well, of course, you still got to meet the test of it being best value. But there's not really a lot of explanation out there of, well, what is best value? How do I demonstrate best value? What does that look like for me? What does that mean that I have to do to show that I have searched for the best value?
And the evaluation process around that. So we've begun this conversation in terms of it being a relatively blunt tool if it's just going to be evaluated on cost alone. But if we flip it around and we have a 60 for quality and 40 for price, then all of a sudden you've got a little bit more work to do, undoubtedly. Okay, let's not get away from that. But the prize is that you will be able to evaluate that in a way that perhaps reflects your own values and in terms of what you really want to see from that contract. So it's
Come in there again.
yes.
So obviously as a contractor trying to bid for work, clients often ask us, tell us how you're going to bring best value to this procurement. So that's really difficult if the client hasn't kind of engaged in any way. So it's like someone's just said that best value is so different for different people. So coming with clients to
Well, this is it.
Definitely.
This is it, and this is one of the teaching points actually for the organisations. Because if your ITT documents are not specific enough about what you're looking for, what's important to you, what social value is important to you, then you might get offered something, you know, if you don't say, you might get offered something that somebody thinks is really useful, but to you it's not useful.
The classic for us, we had an ITT out recently, and it talks about condition surveys. Well, I mean, you define a condition survey. You know, is it a drive-by? Is it a full structural? The differences are enormous. And that, before that went out, that should have been teased out with the client. They should have understood what the client's requirements were. Otherwise, it's going to be really nebulous, really open to interpretation, and you're just going to get a lot of stuff back. You, as a contractor, you would either keep your fingers crossed and go in relatively low and hope that you don't get stung, or you're going to build in all of your risk, and then the client's going to look at it and go, I'm not paying for that. That's just ridiculous. You've missed an opportunity to have that dialogue, either at the front end in terms of a workshop or competitive dialogue later on. There's so many tools that are available to the client, and I think we're all going to admit it in this room that is definitely where the upskilling is required.
Yeah,
but where's the money coming from?
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, of course.
As an employer, procuring works, for us it comes down to the employer's requirements. So it's no secret I'm not a fan of design and build because of the variability of the output that you're going to get. But if you've got a clearly defined set of employer's requirements, that I would challenge that we would not be looking 60-40 for quality versus value. The quality has been set in our documents, and with finances as tight as they are, it's always going to be a race to what's best value by lowest price, providing that price is not so ridiculously low that you go, yeah, you can't deliver that.
Yeah.
And so actually we're going to clear that one out of the way. So with that exception, I'm afraid to say it's always going to, from an employer's perspective, it's always going to come down to price if we've set the employer's requirements correctly.
But you have invested that time at the front end.
Absolutely,
Which
because we absolutely want to know what we're going to get. And
Absolutely.
by the way, if your roof's leaking, ring it.
Thank you very
And
much.
I mean, I don't think that every organisation that's procuring is maybe as well organised as you. That the quality of employers' requirements that I see is, on the whole, quite poor. People don't know what they want. Their employers' requirements conflict with their contract documents. So actually, they haven't invested that time front end. And as we're saying, it sounds like you've made a massive leap forward in terms of being prepared, but not everybody is as well organised as that.
Hirsch?
Thanks, Tim. I think you sort of answered my question that I've had, but I'm a chair of clubs at my daughter's school. My wife's a head teacher, and I used to work for the DFE. I love what we're saying here, and I totally agree with you. The reality is this doesn't happen. It can't happen. My school is a local authority school. It's in a London borough that has a £50 million deficit. Their property services team is almost non-existent. They have little to no support to actually help them do any of this. So my question really is the reality of this actually happening, or is it in business as usual? And the other second part of my sort of point, which is probably different, is there's a lot of inefficiencies in procurement in the way that, you know, as consultant,
Yeah.
procurement is a very expensive exercise. How is this going to help drive? Because that money that we spend on procurement could be spent on either social value or reducing the price. But piecemeal procurement is just a nightmare for where I'm sitting at the moment.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's other methods that could help if time is taken to review stuff. So there could be sort of dynamic markets that could help reduce those long-term costs or frameworks or things like that. In terms of kind of the business as usual point, I think it may well be that happens because resource is lacking. But the reality is, I think, as Emma said earlier, there could be a scapegoat at some point. So it's kind of balancing that of, we don't really have the resource, but if we don't follow this, we could be the one that's, you know what I'm...
Sorry.
No, go.
I feel like my head teacher, again, we're at one,
Yeah.
stuck between a rock and a hard
Yeah,
place.
yeah.
They're only people consultants, they have no support from their RD.
Mm.
Genuinely, what do they do? Something simple like a catering contract. They don't know how to write an employer's set of requirements. I've tried to help them, though I'm not an expert in that area. I agree 100% with everything you're going out trying to achieve, but the reality on the ground is there are some schools and trusts that will be able to follow through, but I think the majority of them who have deficits anyway. I mean, my school has a pretty significant deficit
Yeah.
now. They are between a rock and a hard place, and
Yeah, I agree with that. It's really tough. I think the difficulty is we actually need a bit more movement towards consistency, like you're saying. So I actually think that some of the frameworks that are in existence need to provide almost like standard ITT documents, and more of an assistance in terms of guidance on how to use their frameworks, because most of the organisations, they read the legal bit, or maybe they don't even read the legal bit, and they kind of eyes go wide and, oh my God, it doesn't mean anything to me. It's all gobbledygook, because there's no kind of language designed for highly educated people, but who are academics. They're in the industry of education. They've got to a senior position, but their background is education, not procurement or construction. You know, so it's almost like the frameworks need to provide more assistance in leading clients through how they might operate. And then actually I think it would be beneficial for the frameworks, because they would probably find that more authorities were using them because they've made it user-friendly. They've made it in a way that you understand, if I want a catering contract, oh, look, there's one there and here's the ITT that goes with it, and I can't really get myself in trouble then.
Let's have some opportunities now. You know, we started off so brightly, and now we went into... Sorry.
Sorry, I know you can't see.
Yeah.
Just to add to Sarah Ademoyoni, and what you both said. So in terms of employers' requirements, you have some organizations that do have a good high level of assessment of employers' requirements, and they go out to be on the basis of their employers' requirements. But when you then get bids back, most, if not all of the contractors have qualified almost everything, and thereby substituting what the employer really wants
Yeah.
for. And that all boils down to costs as
Yeah.
well. That's one option. The other option in terms of framework is you have a client, you guide your client that, oh, make use of this framework. We've used them before, or we've recommended them before, they're good, they're this. And the client's like, okay, I'll go with the framework. But then we want our own judgment in terms of, we don't want what the framework has produced
Yeah.
and all the contractors or suppliers have agreed to. We want our own unique set of terms and conditions. And then you go out based on that, and then the bids come back all qualified again. So it's like who wins really, because you're there going back and forth. The benefits of going through a framework was supposed to be time saving,
Yep.
where you've lost that time because you keep going back and forth. And in terms of the employer's requirements, some contractors are like, no, we can't afford that. If we have to do this, we have to increase our cost. And the clients are like, no, that's our project. So I don't know, how do we address that?
I agree there's a problem, but mainly it depends on the quality of the framework and the operators of that framework and how strict they're going to be. So, for example, the DFE framework, they're very rigid. These are the boxes that can be filled in. These are the things that can be changed. You want to change anything outside that, go take a run and jump. That's how it works. However, you get other frameworks. I mean, our head office is in Cardiff, so I deal a lot with SUSCAP and South West Wales framework, which a lot of schools are procured through. Contractors take huge advantage of those frameworks, much more so than the DFE framework, to use that to their advantage to change the risk profile, to bring in two-stage tendering and completely change what was the original boundaries. But bringing it back to the Procurement Act, actually, that's what this is supposed to change. So the whole level of transparency and accountability is certainly above threshold contracts. There's going to be publication of contracts. There's going to be publication not only of, brief details, but the full contract. It can be redacted, but arguably, certainly the commentary that's there in the industry says you can't redact terms because that's not confidential. what would be confidential is maybe numbers, but not legal terms. If you're changing the legal terms, you're changing the boundaries of risk, that's publishable. So it's going to be criticised, it's going to be open to challenge, and at some point it will be challenged. So this is the whole idea of preventing contractors being able to act in that way and completely change the boundaries of risk.
Good.
Can I ask a question of where you see that challenge come from? Is it disgruntled contractor who didn't get awarded the contract suing for some form of loss? I'm not going to go contractor.
It looks like they're going to, you only can challenge from process now, can't you, rather than outcome.
Yeah.
So I think that should remove some of the disgruntled, contractors.
I don't think it's going to be from contractors, particularly on a framework basis. I mean, I spent 10 years working for a contractor, and nobody wants to put their head above the parapet. Nobody wants to say, I challenge that this isn't the right contract terms, because nobody wants to be kicked off the framework. And they also know that if they've, perhaps twisted the contract terms during that two-stage tendering phase on one job, well, whoever they lost to will have done it on another job. They're all in the same game, so they're unlikely to challenge.
Challenge come from? Because we talk about challenge, you talk about penalties that people made an example of. Where's that actually risk-centred? And therefore, how do we minimise that risk? Is it a regulatory risk? Or is it somebody going, no, I don't like this?
Do you know what? I think probably, of course, you've got the procurement side of things. I think it might be more of a public law JR sort of situation of saying this is ultra vires or whatever it may be, just beyond the scope of what was originally procured, thereby outside the powers originally permitted. So whether it would work in practice or not is debatable, but I still think it's more of a what's the word I'm trying to say? Public perception, I suppose, is the way that I would say it. So if you are just not following the rules, etc., may not be that someone's got the resource to challenge, because that's expensive if it goes to litigation, but the fact that it is known that an authority just isn't complying with the Act may not be great. It could be whether suppliers say, we don't want to work with them because they're changing the terms, or it could be, we don't think they're using our funds effectively. I think they're kind of more the areas where there's going to be an issue, and public scrutiny would be my thought.
Yeah, I mean, certainly in Wales, it's more independent organisations like Constructing Excellence that are trying to move towards making consistency between the frameworks. And I see it more as individual contractors may be able to see a published contract and go, well, those weren't the terms that we tendered on, so here's a problem. And they may then send it to or highlight it to a larger organisation who may take up the baton and say, well, is this a regular thing across the framework? And then perhaps challenge it with the framework and try to move change along that way. Because I think it's individual organisations like contractors are not really going to want to do that. They're not going to want to spend the money, cause an issue with a framework that they need. They need the revenue from the jobs.
Before we go back to opportunities, is there any other questions?
Not a question, more of a comment, just trying to make sense of it. So are we saying that the methodologies that are available are kind of off-the-shelf ones that you get from frameworks, or potentially central government putting together a suite of procurement processes that people then get, feel secure that they're meeting their requirements as set by the or other bodies? Or you have the option, the other one, which is an ER process, employees requirement process, which is if you have the money and you have the upskilling and the time, the right people, you can go that. I think the actual essence of it is to bring consistency
Yeah.
and to bring speed and to reduce the risk profile. So they're the two things that we're saying is the way forward, right?
Yeah. So understanding the framework that you're using, actually reading it, is a good start. So following the step-by-step process in the framework rather than assuming that because you're tapping into a pre-procured Procurement Act compliant framework, then that's fine. It's actually, okay, right, I want to use this framework. Where's the framework agreement? What does it say I have to do? How do I go about doing a mini competition? If I want to direct award, what are the steps I have to take? Do I need to make a justification for a direct award? And looking at it from that perspective. And then from a kind of smaller scale, lower value, do I understand what it means to achieve best value for my organisation? What sort of things does that mean I should be asking for? I mean, I think there's quite a lot of information out there, but it's not all in one place. It's not easy. It's not an off the shelf. It's not a, here you go, take this document and run with it, and this is exactly what you need to do. It's probably amongst 1,000 documents somewhere on Google, but it's not easy. I feel your pain, especially if you're in a smaller organisation that just doesn't have the funding to kind of invest front end, which is why government and frameworks need to do it.
I think that's a really good point, because at the beginning we said there's perhaps an over-reliance on frameworks, but you know, if an organisation's cash-strapped or just doesn't have the expertise, ultimately it's contractors and consultants who pay the framework fees when we get appointed. And so, yeah, I mean, are there any frameworks that are particularly good at training? Are there any frameworks that are particularly good at holding events? Those types of things, the upskilling, that maybe is an industry we need to push back on.
I would say that they're not as good as they should be. They're definitely, and I think the perception needs to be changed as well, because there's things like Crown Commercial Services Framework who have got, hundreds of different frameworks for procuring different things, but they don't lead you through the process of what does that mean for you? How do you operate our framework? They sort of just put the document out there and go run with it, which if you're not used to it, if procurement isn't your day job, you're not going to understand how to do that. So I do think that's something for the frameworks to take on board, actually. They have framework fees. Perhaps they need to think about investing some of that framework fees into upskilling organisations to allow them to use the frameworks more efficiently, to make sure that the way that they use them is compliant. Because I think what we found with some of our clients is there's an assumption that if you notify the framework that you're using their framework and you tell them about the contract, that they'll check that it's compliant with procurement legislation. But that's not the function of the framework. The function of the framework is to provide this framework, and you can use it if you want to. How you use it and whether you use it compliantly is for you, and it's on you to check that. So I do think that providing some help to allow organisations even to know that they should be asking the questions rather than assuming that it's all fine because I've gone with a recognised framework would be a massive leap forward in terms of helping particularly those smaller organisations.
Yeah, I would add to that, even not necessarily the help side of things, although I think that's really useful. Not being so convoluted, I think, is one of the issues I'm seeing. So a silly example is someone said to me, I want to use a framework for X, whatever it was, whatever the service or the works was. I don't know which framework to use, and it was just something as basic as that of, I don't actually know what I need, which one am I using? So I think it does need strengthening from that side of things. And I think that in itself will allow a better ability just to get better value, just because you're not using so much resource, just working out something as simple as that. So yeah, I agree, unfortunately. Opportunities?
Yeah. It's knocking.
Okay, shall I start?
Yeah.
So we've talked about away from meat to mat. So it's kind of that holistic value of beyond price. So it will help with those social value goals you may have, things like that, and just make that more rounded. procurement exercise and well-rounded contract. Linking to that is SME and VCSE participation. We've got in the Procurement Act a heightened requirement for SME engagement. I've seen at another conference I went to, there are organisations out there now which are trying to engage partnerships between SMEs so that they can create consortiums to enter into contracts. You know, that's something that's really positive that's coming from this. So local entities are able to group together to have higher value contracts. Again, enhancing social value, things like that. We've said innovation has got its pros and cons, but the ability to innovate is so useful and also meet sustainability goals. So competitive flexible procedure enables that by designing those processes like we discussed earlier. And the other point I've got as an opportunity is dynamic markets. So dynamic markets used to be dynamic purchasing systems with slight enhancements, but dynamic markets effectively have a wider range of contracts you can use them for. So it should, in theory, after our discussion, allow for more agile estates procurement in some circumstances because you don't have to repeat a full tender exercise. So things I was thinking of were things like facilities management and small construction exercises. So there may be dynamic markets out there that sort of fit those requirements for you. Those are my opportunities. Anything to add? Or?
No,
that's fair.
no, sorry, that was quite blunt.
We've set up in terms of opportunities, we've set up our own DPM in terms of making sure that anyone that works for us has been pre-vetted. So there'll be an SQ1.
Yeah.
They'll have obviously had to have registered at the Central Digital Platform anyway.
Yeah.
Then they can passport that into, obviously, into other frameworks. So that we can undertake all of that due diligence on behalf of our clients so that they do not go to market and instruct anyone that's not already been through our own rigorous version.
Yeah.
And the SQ2 opportunity is if we do go into a further level of not just basing it on price, but to set SQ2s in terms of very specific responses, method statements for that particular site, that particular work package, etc. So that we would, and obviously into the dialogue with the client to understand perhaps what their social value aim would be, to include that in there, a handful of KPIs to ensure that that's exactly how it's been delivered, and obviously a 360 review at the end to ensure that it did happen, and if it didn't happen, continuous learning by capturing what didn't work that time. So there's lots of opportunities from that as well, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's a really valuable tool you've got there, Tim, because that is, like we've just said, there's this resource issue that we're talking about. That in itself is already helping overcome that by taking the onus off of contracting authorities, by saying, look, okay, we've already considered these, here you go, So it's things like that, and this is what we're saying about the frameworks. If things like that are established, then it means that it's taking that onus away from the resource that's struggling already and enabling to push forward with more procurements that are more aligned to the goals of the authority. So it's just, that is such a good opportunity.
It definitely is. I mean, obviously it's a little unfortunate that at the moment that they've taken away contracting authorities from private enterprises. It's now got to be a public sector. So for us, we're trying to have a relationship with a multi-academy trust who is clearly a public sector, and they can be the contracting authority. They won't have all of these in-house skills, but we can offer that part. Yeah. But then we get into the legals in terms of what risk are they taking on by being the contracting authority and having us try and underwrite everything on their behalf, but there's likely to be gaps because we've got no case law and no challenges. We're all in this sort of strange area again, aren't we? Yeah. Which is going to nicely bring us back into risks now and threats, just to finish off.
Do you want me to go? I think we've already covered this in the past, but a risk of misapplying the Act. So by misapplying the Act, we've got this challenge risk. So that is a potential issue, and to align with that is the resource constraints. On from that, you've also got funding mechanisms, haven't you, through DFE, things like that. If the funding from them is utilised for a contract by a contracting authority, it may be subject to scrutiny. So again, that might be somewhere where there's a clawback provision or something like that if a procurement isn't run effectively. So that's a potential risk to the procurement, and in turn, if they do scrutinise it, they do withdraw the funding or whatever it may be, or just say you need to stop the contract, you've then got the re-procurement cost that's associated with that. So then you're going to double that fee or whatever it may be. So, you know, the advice there is do it right the first time. And I know, as we've said already, that is harder than it sounds. But if we can try to make things as robust as possible with that first step, then you eliminate those risks. And what Emma was talking about earlier, governance documents being updated, that is a big threat, because if they're not updated, the processes aren't put out there, then not only are you not sure of your process, the seniors, sign-offs, whatever, but you've got budget holders who might be taking those smaller contracts for you. They're not going to know what's going on. They're not going to be able to procure it effectively. And it's also something to fall back on if someone does challenge. If there's a governance document that says, right, this is how we did this is how we should do it, and you can then go, yep, we did that. It always helps if there's ever a challenge from whatever perspective. Yeah, they're my threats anyway.
So we've got the notifications, haven't we? The correct number
Yeah.
in the right order, etc. There's a little bit of risk around not getting that right and
There's a
being
huge
challenged.
huge risk around getting it wrong. So from my perspective, if there was one thing that you were going to do and you had very limited budget, it would be to understand exactly what needs to be published and to make sure at the very least that is in your process, that you understand exactly how to publish, what to publish and when to publish.
Just one I want to ask you guys. So let's just say there was a trust out there that was struggling, obviously, to understand all of this, and what they thought they might entertain the idea of doing would be to break down some of the procurement, therefore to remain under the threshold. I'm not talking about £5.3 million contract value. I'm thinking more of consultancy fees. So
Yes.
at the moment, I think including VAT, it's something like 214,000. Okay,
It is.
over the lifetime of the perceived or projected lifetime of that contract. So 60 grand a year or something like that. Okay. So what happens if they decide, well, do you know what, we want to keep it below that, so what we'll do is we'll disaggregate it a little bit and we'll break it down. How vulnerable are they to being caught out by that?
I'm laughing because actually I was asked this question this week. I was acting for an education organisation on an IT type contract, and the value of it is about 250k. And the procurement risk was highlighted to them, and we talked about the best way of essentially justifying a direct award, which is what they'd done under a framework, was to write a report to essentially confirm exactly why they had direct awarded, how they had done it, what process they had followed, the urgency, the whole lack of effective competition for technical reasons. And he came back and he said, well, can't I just split it into two? Because there's sort of too many projects, really. So even though we've originally entertained discussions as one contract, I could split it into two and then that would solve my problem. And the answer was no. I'm afraid that's not. They're still going to treat the two contracts as one contract, because the moment you interrogate anything around the original discussions and negotiations, or if you've, put a notice out there or gone through a procedure, it's going to be obvious quite quickly that was supposed to be one contract. And essentially what you've done is you've artificially split it for the purposes of trying to circumvent the Procurement Act. That's never going to be looked upon favourably, because your whole purpose of doing that is to basically undermine the legislation. And the courts, they don't like that at all.
But it's not hard to predict that there might be a
Absolutely.
few discussions or considerations for avoiding it, because it feels like such an enormous mountain of work to get through. Do you know what? If we can just reduce it a little bit, we can use the exemption and get away with it.
And the other example from that, Tim, is the mixed contract side of things. So we've had it, haven't we, where it's design and construct, and they've gone, well, the construction, that's below threshold. I'll just put it into that category and kind of shoehorned it in. Well, it's the main purpose that you need to identify for mixed contracts. So if the main purpose of that contract actually is services, the design element is so integral to it, that's a service contract, and then you've got that side of things of, well, if someone looks through your documentation and goes, well, actually, no, this isn't a construction contract, the service is the key area that you're dealing with, then again, you're going to have that issue of, well, you've not followed proper process and you've tried to circumvent the rules. So you've got those two side of things. You've got the threshold side of things from the mixed contract side of things, and you're aggregating contracts to circumvent too.
Just
Yeah.
one final risk I just want to throw out there. Obviously, there is the risk of not taking advantage of the opportunity, isn't there? And just
Absolutely.
literally doing the
Absolutely.
same old stuff that you've done every year, procured it on the lowest price, which is not necessarily best value. So that, for me, is flipping the risk on its head, really, and saying, you've got an opportunity, grasp it. If we've got any more final questions, because I know you're all going to be hungry, it's 1 o'clock.
Sorry, just back to the conversation about accessibility and keeping language accessible. For me, fundamentally, it's a translation to what happens on the ground and how you do it. And I think there's something about opportunity and unlocking and making things accessible. So, if it's about reduction of those documents down to a few pages rather than pages and 70 pages of PDFs that you have to go through. One, it's reduction. Two, it's the language. So, am I reading it so I understand it's what we picked up on? But three, it's utilising digital platforms too. Because we're talking about decisions. How do I know what type of documents I should be picking up? What is appropriate for me? And I always go back to kind of, sometimes when you get your passport, and it's really helpful to kind of go through these decision trees. Have you done this? Yes. Have you done that? No. And I wonder whether it's a process that enables people to, in whatever framework that you're going to understand which one I pick through a digital system that kind of shifts it and then sifts it, and filters it down to which is the right one.
Absolutely.
I think that's what I think will help.
Yeah. To be fair, that's something that we have been discussing the past couple of months. We've been discussing it more on a client-by-client basis, public authority improving their own processes and building those decision trees in terms of how to select a framework and then how to use that framework, and then tick boxes of, have you done this? So that when you get to a signature stage, that the person who's signing it, who inevitably hasn't been involved in the full negotiation of it, can check that all the steps have been taken. So certainly that same process of building that into frameworks, on these like Crown Commercial Services, where there are hundreds of different frameworks, if they had a decision tree that sort of walked you through how to select between their different frameworks, that would be massively helpful for organisations that were trying to use the framework. And I think they could certainly learn some lessons from that.
Yeah.
Good call. Very good. Okay, any more? No, okay, listen, thank you very much for attending today. As I said, there was a lot of competition. I hope you've taken some good stuff away today. Thank you to you both for coming along and providing.
Thank you for having us.
More than welcome. And we're all approachable. If you've got any individual questions that you haven't asked, we're all always available. So thank you all for
Absolutely.
attending.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you.